From MTN, the Montana Television Network, this is Face the State.
Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of Face the State. I'm Mike Dennison, Chief Political Reporter for the Montana Television Network. If you're following politics in Montana, you know that Governor Steve Bullock has called the legislature into special session starting Tuesday to address a $227 million hole in the state budget. Bullock has the power to balance the budget by ordering spending cuts for the entire amount, but the Democratic governor has said he'd like the legislature to work with him to soften the blow by approving a series of budget transfers and temporary tax increases to fill about 2/3 of the shortfall. Leaders of the Republican-controlled legislature, however, say they don't necessarily like the governor's plan and are coming up with proposals of their own. This morning, we've invited two key lawmakers to join us and talk about how we got here, the options for fixing the problem, and what may happen this coming week. My co-host today is David Parker, political science professor at Montana State University, and our guests are Democratic House Minority Leader Jenny Eck of Helena and State Representative Rob Cook of Conrad, one of several Republican legislators who's been involved in ongoing budget discussions with the governor's office. Welcome to the show, Rob and Jenny. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mike.
Rob, let's start with you. Let's talk about how we got into this mess in the first place. Of course, we had very expensive firefighting season this year and $40 million of cost overruns there, but we also had a revenue estimate that Republicans adopted that was way off the mark. What happened?
Well, like any estimate, it is just that, right? An estimate is an estimate. I think that we made the proposal to adjust the revenue estimate towards the end of the session, and in doing so, we avoided making some of the cuts then that are being proposed now, right? And so I think from our perspective, we were trying to play the long game on the revenue in an effort to prevent the situation that we're now in. But as to how we got to the revenue estimate and what we missed, I think that we missed on our extractive industries. Those funds didn't come in as we expected them to. And then of course the fire season didn't help there. And then we have the strange anomaly that really nobody's put their finger around yet, and that's taxpayer avoidance in expectation of some federal change.
Representative Eck, we don't want to belabor this point too much, but I'm just wondering how you feel about how things played out with the revenue estimate and just what happened there and whether anything needs to be changed or fixed or what.
Well, I want to point out that the Democrats and the governor put forward a budget with a $300 million rainy day fund that was not passed, that was killed by the majority, and had we passed that budget, we would be in a very different position right now. We opposed the revenue estimate. We thought it was wrong from the beginning, and we certainly voted against it in committee. So it is frustrating to be in this place right now. I think it could have been avoided.
Speaker Knudsen said, quote, "Let's be clear here, the governor expects the legislature to raise taxes on hardworking Montanans before any effort to reduce non-essential services has been made." So, Representative Eck, the governor can make 10% cuts. Why isn't he doing that first before calling the special session?
Well, I would point out that this year alone, we've already made $196 million in cuts since the beginning of the 2017 session. That's on top of cuts to the government in 2015 and 2013. Under Governor Bullock's administration, we've already cut $350 million from the budget. So when you get to a point where we've cut that much out of our budget, you're going to look at cutting bone, frankly. I mean, when we look at the 10% across the board cuts that were in the governor's proposal initially, he can only cut from 3 places because he can only cut by statute from the general fund. So he can only cut from Health and Human Services, Education, and Corrections. And as we all know, those are all very important parts of our government and the services that we provide across the state. So when you look at that list of what those cuts would look like, they are devastating and they are grim and they would have significant impacts on working families across the state. And frankly, it's just unacceptable to cut to that degree.
Now Republicans, Representative Cook, don't necessarily disagree that we don't want the entire 10% cuts. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I do think that's fair. I don't know that there's a majority consensus on that, but I believe there is, that the full 10% is probably too deep on top of the 261 cuts, Senate Bill 261. But to get back to the budget that the governor proposed, let's not forget that budget was wrapped around massive tax increases, and that's how his first proposal balanced.
Well, massive tax increases on the wealthiest people in the state.
Yeah. There was those tobacco. There was a myriad of revenue and, shall we say, enhancers, tax increases.
Tax increases, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, as far as what he's put forth now, the governor, for the special session coming up this week, he's proposed 1/3 spending cuts, 1/3 tax increases, and 1/3 budget transfers. I mean, that sounds equitable, doesn't it? Why are Republicans balking at that?
Well, you know, we do have our share of hardliners, right? The folks elected in 11 and 13 that are vehemently opposed to any tax movement. But I think in general, the 1/3 plan has some merit. I think that there are some holes in the plan, specifically in the transfers, as to what can be done, and you know, the debate will center around whether or not we can formulate the plan to satisfy enough individuals.
The plan calls for temporary tax increases. Temporary, what does that mean? For how long? I mean, that's the fear, right? Every time a tax is temporary, it's easy to say it's temporary and then all of a sudden it becomes permanent. For how long do we need to have these tax increases, and in what areas, according to the governor's proposal?
Well, I would back up and say, I mean, yes, this is what the governor put forward, but it was after 2 months of negotiations between representatives from both the House and Senate Republican and Democratic caucuses. So the governor's proposal is a result of many, many weeks of hard work of trying to find middle ground. This is certainly not what we would necessarily choose to do if we were, you know, rulers of the universe and could manage the situation exactly how we want to. We really have tried very hard to figure out how do we get to majority votes in the House and the Senate, and also make sure that we get the governor to sign this bill through. So just having said that, what we're looking at for the revenue at this point, you know, where we settled in sort of middle ground was looking at a 3% increase on accommodations tax. So that's, you know, hotels and campgrounds, and then a 6% increase on rental cars. So really with a hope of shifting some of this tax burden onto out-of-staters who come in and visit our incredible state every summer and every ski season. But what we're looking at is putting triggers in. I haven't seen the final language of the bill that the governor's putting forward, but so basically we've looked at a third. We have a $227 million shortfall. So if we break that into thirds of about $75 million, it'd be $75 million in temporary revenue. So we would, you know, raise that revenue until we hit that $75 million mark, and then it would drop off. And then $75 million in cuts implemented by the governor at the insistence of the Republican majority. And then third, cuts and transfers that would be put into place by the legislature.
Representative Cook, now talking about these taxes, I know that Republicans in the legislature are not a monolith; they don't all think the same. But we're taxing tourists, maybe the work comp fund temporarily. What's wrong with that? Why not go that route to raise that money to take care of that little segment of the deficit?
Well, I think that there is some thought that some of these would be okay, but in and of themselves, in the way they're proposed today, they're not. I can't see any reason on earth why a Republican would vote to raise $75 million in taxes when we're leaving $30 million on the table with CoreCivic and the private prison. I think that's going to be the crutch of this session, and I think that if that money isn't used to reduce some of the tax burden, especially on the workers' comp side, where we're actually taxing Montana businesses, then I don't see how we're going to get to a solution.
And of course, what he's talking about is let's go to Representative Eck here. We're talking about the private prison in Shelby. There's about $30 million in a fund controlled by that company that the state has paid into. They're offering to give that to the state to help solve the budget deficit in exchange for extending their contract for up to 10 years. And the governor and most Democrats have come out strongly against that. Why is that? Why don't we just take this money? We're going to need the prison anyways. Why not?
So Corrections Corporation of America has a private prison up in Shelby, near my colleague's hometown here. And yes, they are looking to take advantage of a budget crisis in Montana to offer us this, what I would say is a bad deal for the state of Montana. They want to give us our money back. This is the state's money, $30 million, in exchange for a $150 million long-term commitment to them. That's debt that we're committing to for the next 10 years. you know, this is an important contract for the state. It's one that we need to take the time to look at carefully and not try to ram through in a 2 or 3 day special session without full transparency by the public. I don't think this is a time for sweetheart deals. This is a time to really solve our budget crisis, and that's what we need to put our time into.
Let's talk about the optics of this deal. I mean, from kind of a private citizen standpoint, I look at this, I'm like, really? This looks odd. $30 million, I'm going to get something in return for that. This isn't really a political bribe?
No, not in any way. I mean, I guess that's a good question, but clearly it's not a bribe. What it is that the $30 million would be used by the state to purchase the prison facility, make it a public prison, run by the state, thereby forfeiting all the efficiencies that the private system has. But no, I think that they know that their contract's up in 19, and the opportunity to act is between now and 19, and I think that this was one way to bring that to the forefront.
Is it a deal breaker?
It is for me.
It is for you?
Absolutely a deal breaker.
How widespread do you think that is among the caucus?
I think that, once again, I'll get back to $75 million in taxes. Why don't we write those taxes down some, especially with workers' comp and Montana small businesses? Write that tax burden down some, and then we can move forward. To me, leaving this money sit out there is just absolutely ludicrous.
Representative Eck, I want to talk about another one of the proposals in the Republican expansion of the agenda of the session. Of course, as we know, Republicans are going to try to, and probably will succeed in expanding the agenda of the session with their majority power. And one of their proposals is to lower the ending year balance required amount of money. Right now, it's 5% of spending. It may be lowered down to 2%, which just saves us like $120 million, just like that. How do you feel about that? Is that something we can agree to or not? Or you can agree to? Not
well,
me.
It sounds very simple and elegant, but the problem is Montana has a sterling bond rating right now. It's something that has benefited not only the state, but also local communities and counties and schools will use our state bond rating to get bonding for our communities at a low interest rate. And when you start to lower that ending fund balance, it can trigger a downgrading of our bond rating, and that could have long-term impacts on our economy, on our ability to borrow money, on our ability for our schools to bond. So it does seem like an obvious solution, but when you look at it more closely, there are significant concerns that have been raised by financial advisors to the state that cause pause.
Now, Representative Cook, of course, you sponsored the bill that created this in the first place a couple of years ago. How do you feel about this change? Is it something that we should do? And do you agree with this, the theory that it's going to hurt the bond rating for the state and possibly a lot of other subdivisions of government?
I don't. It's certainly not for the state because we never bond. Right?
Right.
Let's not make any bones about that. If we bonded, maybe, but no. Our analysts are telling us that it won't make a difference, and primarily the reason is because we did set up the rainy day fund last session. We've been calling this ending fund balance a rainy day fund, and it really wasn't. And so the purpose of my bill last session was to raise the required ending fund balance in order to satisfy creditors, bond raters. Now that we've established what is truly a rainy day account, that in and of itself is expected to suffice with bond rating agencies, and our analysts tell us that it does. So I guess we have a dispute there of expert witnesses.
Why expand the session? What's the logic behind it, and what are some of the other proposals Republicans are suggesting?
Well, quite honestly, you expand the session because right now, as the governor's call stands, it is unlikely to be successful. So the session is expanded in order to acquire enough other interest in order to maybe get to a solution. Right now, quite honestly, I think that given the governor's call and the do nothing call, I think the majority is inclined to do nothing.
If the session expands, Representative Eck, should we think about other things that should be under consideration in a special session? I mean, part of the reason we're in this pickle is the extractive money is not coming from the extractive industries. And we have this kind of cyclical up and down problem here in Montana. Why don't we do broader structural reform of the tax system during this session, in addition to these other ideas that the Republicans want to expand into?
I think there's a general recognition on both sides of the aisle that we do have structural issues that we have to address. I think it's very difficult to make massive changes to our to our statutes in such a short amount of time. I think the hope is to get up there and to really fix this short-term budget shortfall with a recognition that we need to come in next session with longer-term solutions that absolutely need to be addressed. I mean, this problem isn't going to just go away if we fill the gap. We have to think about our long-term solutions, but it's not a realistic thing to do that in a very, very short amount of time. We need to vet those ideas. We need to have public hearings. It's important that there be a real process behind big changes like that.
So far, we haven't really talked about the budget cuts that are going to happen in some form. Right now, the governor one of the things that he's proposed is about $100 million total in cuts to the Department of Public Health and Human Services, including closing some offices in a lot of small towns of public assistance and cutting a lot of services out in the field. Representative Cook, are you okay with that? You think this is something that's acceptable?
Well, let's be clear. The $100 million sounds more than the $75 million that he's cutting.
Federal and
right,
the
$100 million
and state
includes
funding.
probably 60, 70 million of federal money. I noticed that he did pick 19 rural locations to consolidate. I've seen the list. Whether or not how the governor runs his agencies really isn't the purview of the legislature, right? And so I don't know how far in the weeds any Republican or any legislator, for that matter, wants to get with the specifics of what the governor's selected to do. I think that the governor needs to live with the ramifications of his decisions.
Yes, Representative Beck. And I have a question for you, but you want to say something too.
Yeah, I do want to weigh in on that because I think
Certainly.
it's really important to point out again, the governor is limited in where he can cut. So if we look at $50 million in cuts into the Health and Human Services, that triggers an additional $60 million in federal funds that are lost to the state.
Yes.
And then in addition to that, we have massive cuts to higher education. We have massive cuts to programs across the state. And he's in a bind. I mean, as I said, we've already cut so much. There are very few places where we can cut, and he's trying to limit the number of federal funds that we're losing due to those cuts. And this is where I just want to back up to this point around taxes, because I think it's really easy to say, as Republicans, we oppose taxes. Well, when you are refused to raise taxes on multimillionaires in the state, when you refuse to raise taxes on out-of-state corporations, who's paying the cost? Folks who want to send their kids to MSU or U of M are going to pay higher tuition because of that. So there's always a cost. It's not just we're protecting folks from taxes. No, who are we protecting from taxes, and at what expense, and who's hurt by that decision? And I would argue that these decisions have been wrong-headed and are harmful to working folks in the state.
Now, one thing I've heard from some Republicans, you want to reply to this?
I do,
Okay.
briefly.
Certainly.
Right, this mantra that Republicans only oppose taxes on the wealthy is ridiculous. Of course, I oppose raising taxes on anybody, not just the wealthy.
Okay. One thing some Republican leaders have said when we're talking about the budget cuts, they're saying we don't see a lot of personnel cuts in there. We're cutting a lot of services all across the state while leaving what they call bureaucratic bloat and Helena untouched. Is that an accurate or fair criticism in your mind, Representative Beck?
No, I actually spent the morning going through the cuts, and if you look at Department of Administration, if you look at the governor's office, if you look at the legislature, Department of Justice, they're cutting jobs across the board. And there's just, like I said, I mean, you can only cut so much to the point where you're just cutting bone, and we cut FTE both in 2013, 2015 we did vacancy savings, so laid off employees or did not hire new employees. So you just get to a point where there aren't any other places to cut, and unfortunately that's what we're looking at now. And it's, I think too, when we talk about taxes, we have to look at, I would say raising tuition on people is a tax. I would say that denying elderly services is a tax, and when we're putting the burden onto local property taxpayers, we're just shifting taxes, we're not cutting taxes. So I do want to be clear about that.
I hear that term over and over again: bloat, bureaucracy, non-essential services. Representative Cook, let's be specific. If there are other places to cut, where would you do it?
I'm not here to debate the cut list. I haven't objected. I agree with Representative Eck, actually, in the fact that, and this doesn't happen frequently, but there are very few places to go look because of the way the budget is constrained, especially with local education. So the governor has to go to these places to look for money to save. Now, whether or not there's an inversion in these cuts, whether there's too much money the services on the ground. There are too many cuts to services on the ground and too few cuts in Helena. That's a debatable point. But it's always difficult, again, to get within an agency and how can a legislator say who should go and who should stay? I mean, I can't do that, and I never pretended to be a person that wanted to do that. So I'm content that the governor, being the manager of his agencies, should manage his agencies.
Let's talk about the politics of this then.
Okay.
Right? Let's talk about the politics here. Art Whittick tweeted that any legislator voting for tax increases should be challenged and defeated in 2018. So Representative Cook, are you worried that Republicans who raise revenues will be targeted by outside groups with dark money?
Actually, that's an interesting question, because they've already started targeting Republicans. AFP, Americans for Prosperity, has mailed many a legislative district already. So, I guess anybody that's afraid to do their job because some outside group funded by a Kansas billionaire is knocking on your door probably shouldn't have been elected in the first place.
Representative Eck, as far as the politics for Democrats, of course, what you're going to hear from your GOP opponents is the only solution Democrats have are tax increases, and they're coming again saying we got to raise taxes to fix the problem. That's all they ever do. Are you worried about that being kind of hung on your neck and the necks of fellow Democrats in the next election?
No, I'm not worried, because we've provided an array of solutions here. It's a mix of cuts and transfers and taxes, trying to find a balanced approach. As I said, we've spent many months trying to find middle ground here, and we've done our due diligence. And I agree with Representative Cook. At some point, when you're a leader, from the day one, you just have to know what your values are and come up and fight for those values and do the best you can. And you can't worry too much about what the talking heads are saying or what the critics out there, because there's always pressure from the extremes on both sides, and we just have to get up here and do our job, and that's the most important thing.
Speaking of which, of course, we talked a lot about the politics, but doing your job, a special session is a little different animal. Things start tomorrow, Monday, and then Tuesday you convene. Let's talk about the process. How's this going to work? We'll start with you, Representative Cook. How's it going to be different from regular session? Any rule changes, any procedural changes that are going to be a little bit different this time?
Yeah, well, primarily it's different right out of the gate, right? The governor's proposals will be heard in joint committees between the Senate and the House, which is unusual. Typically, a proposal would start in one body or the other. Having the joint committee gives us the opportunity to run the legislation simultaneously, which with the aim to save money and by saving days. I think that the angst is probably going to be much higher than normal at the beginning of a session. In any given legislative session, the angst slowly builds over time as there are winners and losers, and individuals react emotionally to that. That takes time. I think here we've got a lot of emotion coming in on day one, and we've got a lot of people who have ideas that probably won't fly. And when they don't fly, then the anger and the vitriol increases. And I just think that because it's compressed, we'll see a lot more of that sooner.
Is there anything else that's going to be different than we would normally expect from a regular session in terms of the rules and procedures moving forward?
Well, we'll likely, suspend the rules to allow bills to move through multiple motions on the floor. So typically we vote once on a bill and then the next day we vote again, but we'll try to move them more quickly. Again, we're burning cash every day that we're up there, so I think it's going to be incumbent upon all of us to stay disciplined. Leadership will play an important role in asking their caucuses to be disciplined so we can move through this quickly and efficiently to get to a solution.
I'm curious about one rule. Of course, in the Senate, if a bill is tied up in committee, it can be brought onto the floor with a majority vote. In the House, under the regular rules, if that happens, it takes a supermajority, 60 votes, to bring it to the floor. Is that going to be the same thing this session? And is there any concern about that possibly happening? Let's go to Representative Cook first on that.
I think absolutely you have to pay attention to the rule for blast motions in the House. And yeah, I do. I think it's going to be a sticker.
And so there's no move to change that. That's going to be the rule as it is now.
It's not as easy to change the rules as one would imagine.
I wouldn't think so. No.
So, I guess that's just a triage question. Which is more painful?
Rules Committee will meet on Monday, and there will be, sort of the standard rules and then offers of amendments. Obviously, how the Rules Committee votes will then go to the floor, and the floor will have the opportunity to adopt those rules or reject those rules. But, there are realities around the majority will, and that's a challenge. It's certainly a concern about the committee issue.
Yeah, we need to keep in mind that the Rules Committee will have a partisan makeup.
So I'm asking you the difficult question, right? This is a special session, so we don't have many data points here. What's going to happen? Do you think this is going to be resolved within about a week, or is it going to go longer than that? Do you think we're going to have resolution, or are we going to be back at it again in another few months?
Well, there'll always be a resolution. Whether or not everybody's happy with the resolution is what you're asking me, I think.
Yeah.
As it stands right now, no. I think that the resolution that we'll leave Helena with is the governor will have to act on 17-7-140, and we'd be content to take that deal.
Well, I would be extremely disappointed if the GOP decided that all they want is for the governor to slash $227 million in the most inefficient and hatchet-like way. I think we can do this with a scalpel. I think we can do this more carefully as a legislature, and we have a responsibility to do that. The legislature passed a budget that was not accurate. They passed a revenue estimate that was not accurate, and to just say, well, the governor has to go and slash and burn the most essential services in the state, I think would be reckless, and I think we can do better.
So how long?
Last I checked, the governor signed that budget.
Yes, he did. And how long do you think it's going to go? 3 days, they're saying. You think 3 days is a good estimate or not?
How much money is on the board?
I'll bet you $1.
$1?
Yeah.
I think it'll go longer than 3 and less than Saturday.
Okay. Representative Beck, what's your prognostication at this point?
Yeah, my guess is we'll be out of there by the end of the day Friday, just because if we're not at a deal by then, it'll be pretty clear to everybody. And at some point, you just have to, make a solution or not. I hope, though, that we don't go forward thinking it's acceptable to be in the red, because it's not.
What's the lesson coming out of this from the session in 2017 and going to the special session? How is this going to change approaches moving forward, perhaps in the next session? Of course, obviously, we don't know who's going to be in the next session, but is this an opportunity for maybe Republicans and Democrats to come together and actually try to govern and get over some of the polarization we've seen nationally? I'll start with Representative Cook.
Well, first I'd like to back that up a little bit. I think that since 2011, the Republicans and Democrats have done a pretty good job of not becoming as polarized as Washington or states like Kansas, for example. So I think Montana has a history of electing people who want to achieve a solution, right? Not just a political ideology. And so, but the lesson going forward, of course, is that revenue estimates matter. We've been successful and we've been unsuccessful with revenue estimates in the past and in this current session. And anything that we could do that would improve the way that we do that would be instrumental in the next budgeting cycle.
About 15 seconds, Representative Beck.
Yeah, I think we just need to do better about planning for the future. We referenced there's a new rainy day fund, but it's empty. So we need to plan and save for the future, and that means really looking at the structure of our budget, and I think we're going to have to grapple with that next session.
Okay, I'd like to thank our guests for joining us this morning. We've been talking to Democratic House Minority Leader Jenny Eck, State Representative Rob Cook, Republican from Conrad, about a legislative special session which starts on Tuesday here in Helena. Of course, MTN will be providing the full coverage, and we'll see you next time at Face the State.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.